God is love may very well be my favorite Bible verse. I literally learned it on my grandfather's knee, sitting in his lap. He loved that verse. And it is true, I think, if you are lucky enough to know love, as I have, and as John's letter says, you have known God. You don't need to know anything more. You have graduated from your Christian education. If you know love, you have a personal experience of the reality of God, and you become a believer. Even when tragedy strikes and love is taken away, even in our depths of grief, we do have each other and the comfort of memory. I think this is the brilliance of Jesus and communion, what he says that he do this in remembrance of me. To gather at table in peace with friends and family, as with the Passover Seder before, another meal where the eternal and steadfast saving love of God is remembered. As we break bread and share, whether in formal communion or in our homes, we are called back into right relationship with God and with one another. We remember the love of Jesus Christ poured out for us on the cross and the invitation to take his holy love deeply into our own hearts. God is love. And if you live in God's love, God lives in you. It's just that simple. Or is it? Love is beautiful on a greeting card. It gets a lot harder when real people get involved. It would be so easy to be kind and generous and loving all the time if it weren't for all of those annoying people. Irritating, wrong-headed people. People like me. People like you. Today's lesson from John's Gospel gives us just one example among many in the Bible where we see that even those high and sainted disciples argued amongst themselves, even when they sat down for a celebration. Love was definitely not much in the air that night, 6 days before the Passover in Bethany with Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus. Those of you who are in women's fellowship, who are reading now Having a Merry Heart in a Martha World, you'll recognize this Bethany family from the story in Luke chapter 10, where Martha gripes to Jesus, about Mary, that she won't help with the dishes. And here is Mary, again, sitting down at the feet of Jesus. She's a mess. She's no help at all. She prefers to be with Jesus as the men are, instead of helping rather than helping Martha serve the food. But this time, it's not Martha who complains about Mary. It is Judas who goes after her, and again Jesus who comes to Mary's defense. Now, I think before we're too eager to jump on Judas as a cartoon villain, calling him a thief, as our biblical narrator does, with the benefit of some 70 to 100 years of hindsight, let's think for a minute about the point that Judas was trying to make. Here they were in the middle of a wonderful, wonderful banquet. Martha's delicious dinner, smelling so lovely and wonderful, spread out on the table before Jesus. It was a thank you meal, you remember, for raising Lazarus from the dead, just one chapter before. The grieving for Lazarus was over. It was time to celebrate. But then in comes Debbie Downer Mary with her overwhelming tears and her overwhelming smell of her burial perfumes. Remember, these were powerful deodorants. The word perfume doesn't begin to sum up what it meant to have this huge bit of nard, this ointment, enough to hide the stench of a dead body in a hot climate. You do not want this stuff in the room while you're eating. It was enough, John says, to fill the whole house with the smell. Now, can you imagine how you would feel if you were a guest at that dinner, if your wonderful dinner party got ruined like this? If you were Martha, if your sad sack sister, your sobbing, slobbering, melodramatic sister has to ruin the whole thing. What a disaster. It's hard to blame Judas, really, for speaking up. I mean, he sounds a lot like you or me. What reasonable Christian or church committee wouldn't come to the defense of the poor against one love-crazed woman who, in this bath of negativity and grief, goes ahead on her own authority to spend thousands of dollars on embalming ointments for a funeral that might very well not take place? And then to waste a whole bunch of it, not on a dead body where it would actually be needed, but to waste it just on soothing the tired feet of Jesus. That amount Judas quotes of 300 denarii would have been more than a half a year of wages for most of those folks in those days, what would add up for us to around $3,000. That's the important money a poor family saves up to give a decent burial to a loved one, not to lavish on a pedicure. And despite what Jesus said about his coming death, to anoint him with it in advance? I mean, that's the ultimate negativity. Are we just going to give up on our march into Jerusalem before it even begins? Practical people know better than to act like that. You save your hard-gained earnings for the future, for a rainy day. You don't just blow it in one emotional scene. At the very least, you give it away to the poor. You'd think that's what Jesus would agree with. So why does Jesus come to Mary's defense once again? Love. You can answer it in a single word: love. Mary, of all people, got his message. She believed him when he said he had to go to Jerusalem to die. She got the message. He was pouring out his love for the world, making the ultimate sacrifice, and she was responding in love for him, in love for what was not long for this world, his frail human flesh. She was alone remembering what was for Jesus that most important and greatest commandment, that we show our love for God by doing one important thing: love one another. Remember, this is 6 days before the Passover, so I like to call this the second to the Last Supper, the night before Palm Sunday. As far as anyone then knew, it was the last chance they'd ever have to eat together, if it all went as badly in Jerusalem, God forbid, as Jesus had predicted. And here they were, sitting around the table arguing with one another, instead of sharing love and fond memories while they had the chance with their very best friends there in Bethany. You remember Bethany was a favorite hideout for Jesus and the disciples, there on the slope of the Mount of Olives, just walking distance, 1.5 miles east of Jerusalem. You know, I love those words that Jen always uses at communion, how Jesus sat at his disciples with those whom he called friends. I suspect this is a daunting idea to most of us, to think that we dare to call ourselves friends of Jesus, friends of the Lord, just like those friends of Jesus in Bethany. You know, this had to be a shocking concept to the Greco-Roman world that literally put their gods up on stone pedestals. And yet Jesus calls his disciples, Jesus calls us friends, real people like you and me, friends of God. Friends to help God do God's work. So what do you think they were all doing really there, where Mary interrupted their dinner? I'm betting those disciples weren't just quietly praying and eating as we might see them in some kind of romantic painting. If we take off our Bible goggles for a moment, we could see them as they probably really were. This was a band of young men who had been hiding out in the wilderness from the law rebels finally coming back to town to start the revolution. They were following God's anointed Messiah up Mount Zion. They were storming the hill. This was the night before the big battle. Talk about your rowdy St. Patrick's Day party. Most of us know that feeling of highly charged emotions and wildly conflicting ideas and strategies when we feel we are at a precipice, at the brink of God making something entirely new. This is the flip side of having good friends, like good family under stress when we're around the people we love the most in what seems to be a crisis. Those are the times when we can forget to be truly loving to one another. This is why I chose this particular Bible story years ago to act out on a spring youth retreat we had on love. Love was the theme for the whole weekend, and we talked about the 3 Greek words for love. In eros, for instance, a romantic love, erotic love. And then there's philios, the brotherly and sisterly love of friendship, where we get the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And then agape, the great universal inclusive love of Jesus, which we know in his church at Christ's table. So at this retreat, we talked about today's passage from 1 John, God is love. But I had them imagine they were all sitting at table with Jesus in these last days of his life, and they each had an important point they needed to make to get across to Jesus. And I gave them a few ideas, but the rest they came up with and improvised on their own. Things like, well, Jesus, it's just too soon to try to march into Jerusalem. We need to wait. We need to hold back. It's just not safe. Or Jesus, it's all fine, this little riding in on a donkey thing and the palm branches, but what we need is weapons and more men. This is foolishness to come into the city in an unarmed parade. Or, Jesus, what we really should do is we should sneak into the city at nighttime, and then we'll surprise them, and then we'll be safe. It was great. They got into an all-out shouting match. Terrific. It was almost a food fight. But later, we met together in small groups, and we confessed a bit to our human frailties. We talked about how fear and grief can get away from us. Stress can make us do all kinds of crazy and unchristian things. We shared personal stories and how knowing Christ through the love of real human beings, real friends, can help us navigate our way through those terrible valleys of the shadow where we just don't know what lies ahead. Tears were shed that day and old grudges were healed. And I'm telling you, this is what the love of God can do if we can allow ourselves to do what John suggests, to live in love and let love live within us. Our human love makes God's love real and tangible to the world. This is what Jesus says we are to become, his best friends, his living body. He calls us to offer our frail human flesh as vessels for the Holy Spirit. Imagine that. God thinks this much of us, that we, broken and imperfect disciples, can actually bear the loving spirit of the risen Christ within us and show it as an example to the world, not just on Easter and not just on Sunday, but in each and every day of our lives. Thanks be to God for this good news. Amen.